everyone, Yav and Callie here. It's actually Yav speaking. We're looking today to have a first pass at the Sanctum of Domination, our fun raid into Torghast. We managed to get in for some testing earlier on this week, which is very useful to see some of the fights firsthand, but it's always useful to have a look through the maps of the area, talk about bosses, talk about anything that might should be key on those as well. We're actually standing here at the entrance to the instance with Thrall, Jaina and Bolvar just down the hill. And actually this is the entrance all the way into the first raid boss. If I open up the map I can start to talk you through these. In the first layer here that is actually the Tower of the Damned, we actually come into the fight and our first boss is going to be the Terror Group. As you can see, it's actually quite a big area around here, and the reason for that is there are 4 ads around this area that will give everyone in the raid a set of 4 options of anima powers to be able to help with killing the Terror Group. As you can appreciate, some of those are quite powerful. Some of them are things like you have 30% increase in primary stats, but you can't jump. These things you'll have already seen in Torghast, and some of them are more fight-specific ones, such as the boss abilities, the AoE abilities do 90% reduced damage. We're obviously going to be spending a fair bit of time clearing out this area and making sure you have the right powers, because you can actually re-roll them as well, which could lead to some fun and games of trying to make sure that everyone's got the right power to be able to complete the encounter. There's also some which are a little bit trolley, such as the ability to be able to knock back people within 2 yards of you. So, any of those big meaty melee boys who want to just troll their rogue or warrior friends might just do that, just step back and forth and knock back their tanks, for instance. All told, this looks like a relatively straightforward boss. Apparently, actually, once you get the right powers, it's quite doable, and it should be a fun entry boss into the raid, and hopefully actually a fun entryway for people into Mythic as well, if the anima powers help them to get through the encounter. Once we've finished with the Terror Group, we actually start to move upstairs into the raid and move on to the second and third boss. These first 3 bosses look to be linear. It looks like you can hear the map down in the bottom right, and actually looking at the map it feels like there's going to be a fair amount of trash between these bosses as well, as you're moving through. As we move through the corridors, the second boss we'll encounter is the Eye of the Jailer. In terms of a fight, this feels like it's going to be a number of phases that are going to cycle through, where you'll have some time fighting the boss, then you'll have to add, then you'll have the boss again, then you'll have to add. So it should be a relatively straightforward fight where you get into that rhythm of each of the phases essentially. Again, from PTR testing that seems relatively easy, but that makes sense to be the second boss in the raid, and the first real boss in the raid without any anima powers. As we move further through the raid, we move to our third boss, which is the 9. Thematically, this is meant to be the 9 Valkyr that were with Sylvanas. In reality, the boss should really be called the 3, primarily because you only fight 3 of them, and the other 6 happen to occasionally flap around and put lines down the floor, similar to the massacre from Sides and Atherius, to try and essentially kill you and do damage. Realistically, the boss is relatively straightforward. There's a few bits of mechanics there of getting out. You fight two of them first, kill them at the same time, and then you end up with the real boss essentially after that. That's where the fight really starts. Nothing majorly overly awkward in there, and again probably just a nice easing into the raid, probably a good place to kind of add the first raid Finder Wing as well, just to get people into the theme of the raid. I think what's really interesting so far is some of these first 3 as well. It feeds into more about what we've been seeing in the Shadowlands. We're fighting the Terror Group from the tower, from Torghast, we're fighting the Eye of Jailer, and taking out that mechanic from down in the moor, which will be a blessing for it really. That's just been a pain since the start. And getting into that third boss there, whilst a lot of people would appreciate the lore implications of that, going in there and fighting the 9th Valkyr, the Moon Sylvanas, will be very interesting to see if there's any sort of cutscenes or real text around there as well from that point of view. Let's move on. This is likely to be the second wing from a raid point of view, and again from the entrance here it looks like these 3 bosses might be able to be attempted in any order. I suspect like any raid there's going to be one that's going to be harder than the others, but the bosses in this area are Sorrender, Domination, Painsmith Rasnell, and the Remnant Nezul. But let's start with Soul Render Domination to start off with. There's a bit of a lore spoiler here, so if you want to stop here or skip past, you'll be able to skip past the next boss. But within the Soul Render Domination fight, we're actually helping to free Garrosh Hellstrom from the Soul Render. There are a number of mechanics in there that are kind of reminiscent of old bosses. You've got a safety dash and dance across the room, very similar to Helgen back from Naxxramas. And a few other things in there, such as we've got to break some chains on Garrosh and so on and so forth. Looks like a quite a movement heavy fight, and actually interestingly as I sort of start through these more, you'll start to see the bosses actually look like they're putting more weight on the tanks themselves rather than just being defensive. If you think back to Castle Nathrium, there is a number of fights where a tank basically just stands still and doesn't do a vast amount. You think the dogs, the main boss from Huntsman, you think about Shriekwing realistically, you think about Artificer, all those bosses realistically are very, very static, and a lot of these are a lot more movement heavy. Coming on to movement heavy, we'll move on to Painsmith Rasnal. Painsmith Rasnal could very well be early on a real pug killer, primarily because the fight involves two key mechanics that I think can be tricky. The first one is that he will present a row essentially across the platform of orbs that you can DPS, and you need to break one of them to be able to move through them. And that's very reminiscent of the Nezul fight from Shadowy Burial Grounds. The second one really is a kind of pulse wave that goes across the platform step by step and puts spikes along to deal damage. That's very similar to Hans and Franz from Blackrock Foundry to a certain degree, where you will see that telegraph coming towards you, but you just need to be aware that it's actually happening as well. Again, the coordination of what do we DPS and having overlapping mechanics, certainly very early on, could become a bit of a pug killer with a few other things lined up there as well. The third boss on this floor, or on this wing ending, is Nezul. Again, coming back into the lore of where we are, Nezul of course was the Lich King prior to Arthur's taking of that role. And again, it's interesting to see those legacy, those longer term characters coming back into play. It's very, very much leading on the history and the lore of Wrath of the Lich King. Looks like a fairly cool fight, realistically. You're attacking Nezul. He looks very much like a Lich King in his armour and his helmet. And as you deal more damage, you're knocking bits of the armour off, and you're visually seeing the model change, which is something we haven't really seen for a very, very long while. Well, in fact, I can't recall another boss that acts in a very, very similar way. No, not off the top of my head. Again, though, there's a lot of movement in this fight. There's some big knockback mechanics. There's lots of people running to pick up orbs and throw them off the edges and pause to move. It feels like a very hectic fight, and again, with the ability for individual players to cause knockbacks in individual directions, this again could really be a troublesome one for pugs very early on. Until people get more and more familiar with the mechanics. I suspect what we'll see as we go into this is more of a commonality of how it's approached, and which side we drop the orbs off, and which side we drop the debuffs on, for instance. So that takes us through what is probably the second wing of the raid, essentially. Let's move on to the third, where again we're seeing a floor with 3 bosses in. It's likely that 2 of these will fall. Maybe all 3 of these might fall, but we're not 100% certain yet. These bosses are Fate Scribe, Callow, Kel'Thuzad, and Guardian of the first ones. Now Kel'Thuzad is almost certainly going to be the last but one, so that's probably going to be locked away, but you might have options between these other 2. Let's start down at the Fate Scribe Callow, because he's at the bottom of the list. Interestingly, even from the map here, you'll notice a pattern on the floor of those circles, and they play a very prevalent part in the fight, where at a point in time you actually have to line up the runes that are on those particular wheels with a specific corresponding point, and people have to stun them. So as a mechanic itself, That's going to be the tricky one again of people. If an odd number of people stand on that particular ring, it goes clockwise. If an even number of people stand on the ring, it goes counterclockwise. And making sure people aren't running across them and kind of stopping it from going in different directions is going to be very, very interesting. Those mechanics happen 3 times in the fight. It's set percentages, so you can really prepare for them and line up for them and organise them. But it does require some communication probably ahead of time, which again, it's another boss that feels like it may be a struggle in an environment where you're not communicating, where you're not on comms and not organising things early on. I mean, apart from that phase, that's the real difficulty with it. The other phases, the other bits in there are very, very normal to us. You know, there's lines across the ground which don't stand, there's debuffs to get out from, there's, you know, debuffs to dispel, so all relatively straightforward stuff, but certainly the rings there and the movements of those is the unique mechanic of that particular fight. If we come up to the Guardian, the first one, again as a fight, this is quite a prescribed movement fight realistically. You know, you're tanking a single boss, relatively straightforward from that point of view, but there are instances where you want to be stacked up very close together. There's instances where you need people to be spread out because they've got a debuff on them, and there's this constant circle that's floating around, just pacifying people to stop them doing damage and hitting them. The key mechanic here really is the energy of the boss and the crystals that are around. You've got 3 crystals to be able to charge the boss back up with, but when you're charging, that does a massive raid-wide AoE damage, which is reduced by being close to that particular crystal. So in terms of fight, it feels again like it's going to be a very timing heavy, whereby you'll want those spread out debuffs to have been dealt with and instantly want to converge back onto a crystal in order to get the maximum amount of charging time on those. Again, you know, that might involve warlock gates to be able to get across the room, so you're leaving that patrolling circle behind you and things like that. But again, looked like a fairly cool fight, to be fair. Our last but one boss is Kel'Thuzad. There's a certain amount of callbacks here back to the fight, obviously, from Naxxramas, in terms of the fact that it's Kel'Thuzad himself and quite a lot of ads. What you get is different phases of the fight where you'll be fighting Kel'Thuzad or you'll be fighting ads. At a point you actually go into his phylactery as well. And at that point the raid has to split up into 2 groups. One group to do damage inside the phylactery, the other group to deal with the ads outside. So again, it's going to be a very, very heavily coordinated fight, with a final burn phase with condensing the space in the room just to try and push through and race towards the end. A lot of kind of callbacks to what you saw in Naxxramas in terms of some of the abilities, and certainly looked like a very, very cool fight. And last but by no means least, we move on to Sylvanas now. The interesting thing here is looking at the maps, you can already tell if we've covered 9 of the bosses in the first 4, these other 3, well actually we start up at the pinnacle of Domination. And that is essentially at the very, very top of Torghast itself. You can stand there and you can look up and actually see, you know, that fracture in the sky, still looking like you can see the blue frosty ice ground on the other side of it essentially. This was an incredibly punishing fight actually on the PTR. To start with this first phase. The first phase largely is you fighting Sylvanas to try and get her down to a certain percentage to move through. Sylvanas, actually the model itself has a really cool ability which essentially is Windrun. What it does is it makes Sylvanas appear in other areas and look like she's kind of almost teleporting from area to area, firing lots of arrows off. Really confused to start off with, to be fair, because of course you're thinking the boss is over there, I'm meant to run over there, I'm meant to run over there. And in actuality what it was you could still hit the boss from where they cast that, from where Sylvanas cast that ability, so it's not going to be completely unfriendly to melee in the fact that you've got to chase after this model that's teleporting off to random points. But thematically it's just very, very interesting, very cool to look at. She fires arrows down that chain to people, you know, and if they get to the arrow they get killed. Lots of AoE damage here coming into the raid. Lots of AoE damage required to get those actual arrows down, so you can break those chains off people. You know, unfortunately playing a Moonkin as a main, Starfall's going to be a very, very big friend here. but you don't build a comp for the first phase of a boss. Once you get through to percentage, Sylvanas breaks away and actually goes towards Ouroboros as by all accounts there's going to be a cinematic there to be able to help you through and explain what's happening. But we actually move into the next phase of the map, which is the Edge of the Abyss. Now, you'll look at this and I'll look at this, and we'll already know, people, that you're thinking, those paths look quite narrow. There's going to be some people falling to their death here, I would suspect. Not only that, actually, there's paths in between these chains as well that are made, because in the second phase you've got Thrall and Jaina helping you, making paths of really, really cool looking, either paths of frost or ice in between the chains as you're moving forward, you know, towards Ouroboros itself. This is largely a gauntlet. What you're trying to do is keep moving forwards, keep making progress, controlling a wave of Morsworn that are attacking you. The Morsworn themselves aren't just trash mobs. They put out a load of curses by all accounts. They have stuns, they have, you know, even some knockbacks, I believe, in some cases. And it's going to be really interesting to see how that all plays out in a very, very confined space. You've almost got to make certain checkpoints as you go along as well to be able to stop Sylvanas from casting her spells and to be able to help Jaina and Thrall at various points to make sure they don't die. And if you're getting close towards them and you're not quite there, actually your healers can heal Jaina and Thrall as you're moving through. It's just to be able to buy yourself some extra time. I would suspect that, again, this is a nice thematic area. Certainly it felt like from the bits we saw in the PTR that if you got to this phase, it was easier than the first phase to progress into the third phase. And the third phase is actually back in Ouroboros. Now, this platform may look familiar to the fact that actually this is where the Arbiter is. And the Arbiter's on this little diamond here. This diamond there is actually the platform that we stood on right at the very start of the Shadowlands as we came to see her. And these 4 platforms around the edge were actually corresponding to each one of the Covenants. And you can tell that very slightly, I think, really, from the logos that are there on each of the corners. This fight here is going to be, again, really, really cool, I think. It feels like it's going to be very heavy movement, where you're moving from platform to platform, you're controlling puddles of debuffs, the platforms get destroyed over time by all accounts, so again, you're just cutting down that real encounter space. And as a raid, you'll be moving around, probably kind of either clockwise or anti-clockwise around these. Whilst in the middle, what you end up seeing is you see Anduin fighting Thrall, Bolvar and Jaina. Doesn't look like they have health as a timer as such. I think the timer and kind of the push on this particular fight is going to be more to do with the kind of the space reduction you're going to feel as those platforms start to fall apart, as you start to get more pools and debuffs on the floor. Interestingly, the Arbiter is visible in this fight. He's actually almost standing doing something over here looking, the Jailer's over here looking at the Arbiter. And again, I would suspect that as we come to the climax of this fight, we'll really start to see where the expansion's going next. Whether we're staying where we are, whether we're moving on somewhere else, will be a very, very interesting thing to get there, and certainly something I'm looking forward to.